The parking attendant's eyes burned with disgust as he approached my car, his hand already reaching for his citation book before he even saw what I'd done wrong. "You people think you can park anywhere you want," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt that made my hands tremble on the steering wheel. "Which country are you listening from? Tell us in the comments below." My name is Maya Rodriguez, and I never thought a simple trip to the grocery store would become the day that changed everything about how I see myself, my country, and the power of standing tall when the world tries to make you small. It was a Tuesday afternoon in Phoenix, Arizona, and the desert sun was painting everything in shades of gold. I had just finished my shift at the VA hospital where I work as a trauma counselor, helping other veterans navigate the invisible wounds that followed them home from war. My own invisible wounds were something I rarely talked about. The shrapnel that had torn through my left leg in Afghanistan, the nerve damage that would flare up without warning, the PTSD that sometimes made crowded places feel like combat zones. But on this particular day I felt good. Strong. I had successfully helped a young Marine work through a panic attack during our session, and I was looking forward to picking up ingredients for my grandmother's tamale recipe. Abuela always said that cooking was healing, that the act of creating something beautiful with your hands could mend whatever was broken inside you. The morning had started like any other. I woke up in my small apartment in central Phoenix, the same apartment I'd been living in since I moved back from Germany after my medical retirement from the army. The walls were decorated with photos from my deployment, pictures of me with my unit, images of the Afghan countryside that looked almost peaceful when you couldn't hear the distant sound of mortars, and a framed copy of my Bronze Star citation that I kept more for my grandmother's pride than my own. As I got ready for work, I went through my usual routine of checking my leg. The doctors at Walter Reed had done an amazing job reconstructing the damaged tissue and bone, but some mornings the nerve damage made it feel like electricity was shooting from my ankle to my hip. Today was a good day, minimal pain, full range of motion, and the kind of weather that made Phoenix feel like paradise instead of purgatory. At the VA hospital, my morning had been filled with the kind of sessions that reminded me why I'd chosen to become a trauma counselor after my military service. Working with other veterans who were struggling with their own invisible wounds gave me purpose, a way to transform my own pain into something useful. My first patient was Marcus, a 24-year-old Army specialist who'd been struggling with nightmares since returning from his second deployment to Iraq. During our session, he'd finally opened up about the guilt he felt over surviving an attack that had killed two of his closest friends. It was the kind of breakthrough that made all the difficult days worth it. My second patient was Jennifer, a Navy corpsman who'd served in Afghanistan around the same time I did. She was dealing with the challenge of transitioning to civilian life while managing chronic pain from injuries sustained during a rocket attack on her forward operating base. We spent most of our session working on mindfulness techniques and discussing strategies for communicating with her family about her struggles. It was during my session with my third patient, a young Marine named David, that I'd had the interaction that left me feeling particularly strong and capable. David had been struggling with severe anxiety that made it difficult for him to be in crowded places, grocery stores, movie theaters, anywhere that crowds gathered. He'd been working toward the goal of going to a grocery store alone for months. During our session, he'd experienced a panic attack while we were doing exposure therapy using virtual reality scenarios. Instead of backing down, I'd walked him through the breathing techniques we'd been practicing, helped him ground himself using the 5-4-3-2-1 method, and watched as he regained control of his anxiety. "Doc," he'd said to me as our session ended, "you really get it, you know? Like, you understand what it's like because you've been there too." It was moments like that which reminded me that my own struggles hadn't been in vain. Every nightmare I'd overcome, every day I'd pushed through pain, every time I'd refused to let my injuries define my limitations, all of it had prepared me to help other veterans navigate their own journeys toward healing. I pulled into the parking lot of the upscale grocery store in North Scottsdale, the kind of place where organic kale costs more than most people spend on lunch. My beat-up Honda Civic looked out of place among the BMW SUVs and Tesla sedans, but I had every right to shop there. My veterans' disability compensation and counselor salary might not buy me luxury, but they bought me dignity and choice. The grocery store in Scottsdale wasn't my usual place to shop. Normally, I went to the Fry's near my apartment, where the staff knew me and where I felt comfortable. But today I needed specific ingredients for my grandmother's tamale recipe. Masa harina from a particular brand, dried chiles that weren't available at every store, and the kind of lard that came from a butcher shop rather than a supermarket shelf. My grandmother's tamale recipe wasn't just about food, it was about connection, tradition, and the way that cooking could bridge generations and heal wounds that couldn't be seen. Every year since I'd returned from Afghanistan, Abuela and I had spent the week before Christmas making dozens of tamales together. She would tell me stories about her childhood in Sonora, about the journey she and my grandfather had made to Arizona in the 1960s, about the discrimination they'd faced and the dreams they'd held for their children and grandchildren. Mija, she would always say as we spread masa on corn husks, when you make tamales, you put love into every fold. The food becomes medicine, becomes memory, becomes hope. The parking lot was packed, as usual for a Tuesday afternoon. Soccer moms and retirees navigated their shopping carts while talking on phones, their voices carrying complaints about everything from the weather to their housekeepers. I circled twice before spotting an open space, a disabled parking spot right near the front entrance. As I circled the parking lot, I noticed the usual dynamics that played out in spaces like this. The expensive cars claimed the spots closest to the entrance, their drivers moving with the confidence of people who'd never had to question whether they belonged somewhere. The older vehicles like mine gravitated toward the edges of the lot, their drivers more careful, more deferential, more aware of being watched and judged. I reached for my disabled veteran license plates, the small metal rectangles that represented so much more than just parking privileges. They represented the day an IED exploded 20 feet from my convoy in Kandahar. They represented the 3 surgeries to rebuild my leg. They represented the nights I still wake up in cold sweats, my heart racing from dreams that smell like smoke and sound like screaming. Those plates told a story that most people would never know just by looking at me. They told the story of a convoy that was supposed to be routine, a supply run to forward operating base Shank that had been completed dozens of times before. They told the story of Staff Sergeant Martinez joking about his wife's cooking just minutes before the world exploded in fire and metal and screaming. They told the story of waking up in a medical tent with my left leg held together by plates and screws, being told that I was lucky to still have the leg at all, that the medic who'd worked on me in the field had probably saved not just my leg but my life. They told the story of months of physical therapy at Walter Reed, learning to walk again while also learning to process the trauma of watching friends die, of being helpless to save them, of survivor's guilt that felt heavier than any physical weight. But as I pulled into the space, I realized I had forgotten to transfer my disabled placard from my work bag to my car that morning. No matter. My license plates clearly displayed the disabled veteran designation. In Arizona, disabled veteran plates serve the same function as a hanging placard. I've parked in disabled spaces hundreds of times with just my plates. The Arizona Disabled Veteran License Plate Program was something I'd learned about during my transition from military to civilian life. The Department of Motor Vehicles had explained that veterans with service-connected disabilities rated at 50% or higher were eligible for special plates that allowed them to park in disabled spaces without needing a hanging placard. It had taken me months to apply for the plates, not because of bureaucratic delays, but because of my own reluctance to identify publicly as disabled. There was still a part of me that wanted to pretend my injuries didn't exist, that wanted to prove I could handle everything the same way I had before Afghanistan. My therapist at the time, Dr. Sarah Chin, had helped me work through those feelings during our sessions. Maya, she'd said, using the accommodations you've earned isn't a sign of weakness. It's a recognition of the sacrifice you made and the reality you live with every day. I was reaching for my purse when I heard the sharp tap of knuckles on my driver's side window. Through the glass, I saw a man in his 60s wearing a security uniform with "Parking Enforcement" embroidered across the chest. His face was already twisted with irritation, his gray eyes narrow and cold. The man approaching my car had the bearing of someone who took his authority very seriously. His uniform was pressed and crisp, his badge polished, his citation book held like a weapon. Everything about his posture suggested someone who enjoyed the power that came with his position, who relished the opportunity to correct and control others. I rolled down my window, expecting a polite interaction. Maybe he was new and didn't recognize disabled veteran plates. Maybe he was just doing his job thoroughly. "Excuse me, miss," he said, though the word "miss" came out like an insult. "You can't park here without a disabled placard." The tone of his voice immediately put me on edge. There was no politeness, no professionalism, no recognition that he might be dealing with someone who deserved basic respect. Instead, there was assumption, irritation, and barely concealed disdain. "I have disabled veteran plates," I replied calmly, gesturing toward the back of my car. "In Arizona, they serve the same function as a placard." He didn't even look. Instead, his eyes scanned me from head to toe with undisguised skepticism. I was wearing scrubs from the hospital, clean, professional, clearly indicating I worked in healthcare. My hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, my makeup minimal but polished. There was nothing about my appearance that should have triggered such obvious disdain. In that moment, I could feel the weight of his assumptions settling over me like a suffocating blanket. To him, I didn't look like someone who belonged in this neighborhood, in this parking lot, in this space that was reserved for legitimate disabled people. "You don't look disabled to me," he said, his voice getting louder. "And you people are always trying to game the system. You people." Those two words hit me like a physical blow. In that moment, I knew this wasn't about parking regulations or disabled placards. This was about the color of my skin, about the assumptions this man was making based on my last name and my appearance. To him, I wasn't a veteran who had served her country. I wasn't a healthcare worker helping other veterans heal. I was just another Latina trying to cheat the system. The phrase, "you people," carried decades of weight, centuries of discrimination, generations of being told that people who looked like me were inherently suspicious, inherently untrustworthy, inherently undeserving of the same considerations given to others. I thought about my grandmother, who had heard those same words in the 1960s when she was trying to rent an apartment, trying to get a job, trying to simply exist in a country that seemed determined to remind her that she was an outsider. I thought about my mother, who had heard those words when she was the only Latina student in her college classes, when she was applying for her first teaching job, when she was trying to buy her first house. And now I was hearing those words in 2024 in a parking lot in Scottsdale, from a man who couldn't conceive that a Latina woman might actually be a disabled veteran. "Sir," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady, "I am a disabled veteran. My plates are clearly marked. I have every legal right to park in this space." "I don't see no placard hanging from your mirror," he shot back, his grammar deteriorating as his anger escalated. "That's what the law requires." Other shoppers were starting to notice the commotion. A woman pushing a cart full of organic produce slowed down to stare. A man in a business suit paused his phone conversation to watch. I could feel their eyes on me, their judgment, their assumption that I must be in the wrong. The growing audience made everything worse. I could see the calculations happening in their minds, the same assumptions the parking attendant was making. Young woman, scrubs that could be worn by anyone, beat-up car, Latina features. In their minds, I probably was trying to cheat the system. It was the same look I'd received in college when I was one of only a handful of Latina students in my psychology program. It was the same look I'd received during my military service when some people couldn't believe that a woman, especially a Latina woman, could be serving in a combat zone. It was the look that said, "You don't belong here and we know it." The law in Arizona allows disabled veterans to use either a placard or disabled veteran license plates, I explained, pulling out my phone. "I can show you the statute right now." "Don't you get smart with me," he snarled, stepping closer to my window. "I know trouble when I see it, and you people are nothing but trouble. You people." There it was again. My hands started shaking, not from fear but from rage. This man didn't know that I had spent 13 months in Afghanistan, providing psychological support to soldiers who were watching their friends die. He didn't know that I had earned a Bronze Star for continuing to provide care to wounded soldiers while under enemy fire. He didn't know that the explosion that damaged my leg had happened while I was running toward wounded Marines, not away from danger. The rage I felt was familiar but controlled. It was the same rage I'd felt in Afghanistan when insurgents had targeted our medical facilities. It was the same rage I'd felt when I'd watched good soldiers struggle with PTSD while being told to suck it up by commanders who didn't understand trauma. But this rage was different because it was mixed with disappointment. This was happening in America, in the country I had sworn to defend, in a place where my service should have meant something. All he saw was a young Latina woman who, in his mind, couldn't possibly deserve the same considerations as real disabled veterans. "I'm going to need to see some documentation," he demanded, pulling out his citation book with theatrical authority. "Proof of disability, proof of veteran status, proof that you're not just another welfare case trying to take advantage." The words stung because they revealed the ugly assumptions lurking beneath his official authority. In his mind, people who looked like me were automatically suspect, automatically undeserving, automatically trying to cheat a system that rightfully belonged to others. The request for documentation felt like a violation that went beyond the immediate situation. It reminded me of every time I'd been asked to prove my right to be somewhere, to justify my presence in spaces where others were simply accepted. It reminded me of being stopped by military police on base and asked to show my ID when white soldiers walked past without question. It reminded me of being asked for additional verification when I applied for my veterans' benefits, while other veterans' applications were processed without scrutiny. "I don't have to prove anything to you," I said, my voice finally finding its strength. "My license plates are all the documentation required by law." "We'll see about that," he muttered, scribbling furiously in his citation book. Fraudulent use of disabled parking. That's a $300 fine plus court costs. As he wrote, more people gathered. I could hear whispered conversations, fragments of judgment floating through the desert air. Probably borrowed those plates from someone else. They always try to get special treatment. Looks perfectly fine to me. I bet she's not even legal. Taking advantage of benefits meant for real Americans. Each whisper felt like another weight added to my chest, making it harder to breathe. This was happening in 2024 in America, in a country I had fought to defend. This was happening to a veteran who had given years of her life to protecting the very freedoms that were supposed to protect her. The crowd was growing, and with it, the whispered commentary became bolder. I could see phones being pulled out, some people taking pictures or videos, others making calls. In the age of social media, I knew that this encounter could be recorded and shared within minutes, potentially going viral and becoming another example of discrimination that people would debate online before moving on to the next controversy. The thought of becoming an internet sensation for all the wrong reasons made my stomach turn. I didn't want to be a symbol or a hashtag. I just wanted to buy groceries and go home to make tamales with my grandmother. The parking attendant finished writing his citation and tore it from the book with exaggerated ceremony. "Here's your ticket," he said, shoving the paper toward me. "Next time, maybe think twice before trying to scam the system." But as he extended the citation toward my window, his eyes finally drifted to the back of my car. I watched his expression change as he actually read my license plates for the first time. DV 1847 with the clear designation, Disabled Veteran, printed below. The color drained from his face. "Oh," he said quietly, the citation still frozen in his hand. "Oh," I repeated, my voice sharp with contained fury. "Oh what? Oh, you actually bothered to look at my plates? Oh, you realized that maybe, just maybe, a Latina woman could actually be a disabled veteran?" He started to stammer an apology, but I wasn't finished. "For the past 10 minutes, you have harassed, insulted, and humiliated me based on nothing but your own prejudices," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "You assumed I was lying. You assumed I was cheating. You assumed I was undeserving. All because of how I look." The crowd around us had grown larger, but now the whispers carried a different tone. People were looking at the parking attendant with increasing discomfort, recognizing that they were witnessing something ugly and unjust. I could see the shift happening in real time. The people who had been ready to judge me were now recognizing that they had been watching discrimination unfold. Some looked embarrassed, others angry, a few moved closer as if to offer support. "Ma'am, I'm sorry I didn't," he began. "You didn't what? You didn't see my plates? They're right there in plain view. You didn't bother to look because you had already decided what kind of person I am based on my appearance." My hands were no longer shaking with rage. They were steady, strong, powered by a lifetime of fighting for respect in a world that seemed determined to deny it. "Let me tell you what you didn't see," I continued, stepping out of my car for the first time. As soon as my left leg took my full weight, the familiar spike of nerve pain shot from my ankle to my hip, a daily reminder of the day my Humvee drove over an IED while I was trying to reach wounded soldiers. I couldn't hide the slight limp as I walked around to the back of my car, where my license plates were clearly visible to anyone who bothered to look. The limp made the situation real in a way that words couldn't. I watched as people in the crowd recognized that my disability wasn't theoretical or fraudulent. It was visible, physical, undeniable. "You didn't see that these plates represent 13 months in Afghanistan," I said, my voice carrying across the parking lot. "You didn't see that they represent a Bronze Star for valor. You didn't see that they represent nerve damage from shrapnel that I live with every single day." The parking attendant looked like he wanted to disappear into the asphalt. "You didn't see that I work at the VA hospital helping other veterans deal with trauma," I continued. "You didn't see that I've spent my entire adult life serving others, first as a soldier, now as a counselor." A woman in the crowd called out, "Thank you for your service." Others began nodding, murmuring agreement. But I wasn't finished. "What you saw was a young Latina woman, and you decided that meant I was probably lying, probably cheating, probably trying to take something I didn't deserve. That says everything about you and nothing about me." The parking attendant tried again to apologize, his voice barely above a whisper. "Ma'am, I'm truly sorry. I made a mistake." "You made a choice," I corrected him. "You chose to see my skin color before you saw my service. You chose to see your assumptions before you saw the evidence right in front of you." I took the citation from his trembling hand and slowly tore it into pieces, letting the fragments flutter to the ground like snow. "I won't be paying this ticket," I said calmly. Because it was issued based on prejudice, not law. It was issued because you couldn't believe that someone who looks like me could be a disabled veteran. The crowd had grown to include several other shoppers, including a man who identified himself as a veteran. "This is disgraceful," he said loudly. "This woman served our country and this is how she's treated?" An elderly woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry this happened to you, dear. My grandson served in Afghanistan too. Thank you for everything you've done." A middle-aged man in a business suit stepped forward. "I saw the whole thing," he said. "This is completely unacceptable. I'm calling the store manager right now." But the moment that will stay with me forever came from an unexpected source. A young Latina girl, maybe 8 years old, who had been shopping with her grandmother. She walked up to me with wide, serious eyes. "Are you really a soldier?" she asked in Spanish. "Sí, mija," I replied, switching to my grandmother's language. "I was a soldier and now I help other soldiers feel better." She smiled then, a radiant expression that seemed to light up the entire parking lot. "My mom says Latinos can be anything we want to be. You're proof." Her grandmother, a woman about my abuela's age, approached with tears in her eyes. "Mija," she said to me, "mi nieta has been talking about joining the military when she grows up. She needed to see this, needed to see someone like her who served with honor." In that moment, all the anger and humiliation transformed into something else: purpose. This little girl saw in me not a woman who had been discriminated against, but a woman who had stood her ground and refused to be diminished. The parking attendant had retreated to his security cart, probably writing an incident report that would somehow try to minimize what had really happened. But the damage to his credibility was done. Multiple witnesses had seen his behavior, heard his assumptions, watched him issue a citation without even looking at the evidence that would have immediately proven him wrong. As I finally walked into the grocery store, I realized that this incident had revealed something important about the state of our country. Despite all our progress, despite all our conversations about equality and justice, there are still people who look at a Latina woman and automatically assume she's trying to cheat the system. But it also revealed something important about resilience, about the power of standing up for yourself even when, especially when, it would be easier to just accept the injustice and move on. The grocery store felt different as I walked through its aisles. The same upscale atmosphere, the same expensive products, but now I moved through it with a different awareness. Other shoppers looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Some nodded in acknowledgement, others smiled, a few approached to offer words of support. I thought about all the times I had experienced subtler forms of discrimination. The job interviews where I was told I was almost what they were looking for, the medical appointments where doctors questioned whether my pain was real, the social gatherings where people assumed I was someone's domestic help rather than an invited guest. Each of those moments had chipped away at my confidence, made me question my worth, made me wonder if I was imagining the prejudice or if it was all in my head. But this moment in the parking lot was so blatant, so undeniable, that it crystallized everything I had been experiencing for years. It wasn't in my head. It wasn't imagined. It was real, it was systemic, and it was happening to countless other people who looked like me. As I selected vegetables for my grandmother's tamale recipe, I thought about the conversation I would have with her that evening. Abuela had immigrated to the United States in the 1960s, working in fields and factories to build a better life for her children and grandchildren. She had faced discrimination that made my parking lot encounter seem mild by comparison. Being paid less than white workers, being denied service at restaurants, being told to go back where you came from, even though she was a legal immigrant working harder than anyone around her. My grandmother's stories of discrimination were family legends, passed down through generations as both warnings and inspiration. She had been denied housing because landlords didn't rent to Mexicans. She had been passed over for promotions because supervisors couldn't understand her accent, even though she spoke perfect English. She had been followed in stores by security guards who assumed she was going to steal something. But she had also been the first in her family to own a home, the first to see her children graduate from college, the first to watch her granddaughter put on a military uniform and serve the country that had once treated her as a second-class citizen. "Mija," she would always tell me, "they can question your right to be here, but they cannot question your worth. Your worth comes from dentro, from inside. It comes from your character, your service, your love for others." Standing in the produce aisle, surrounded by the mundane routine of grocery shopping, I felt the truth of her words settling into my bones. The parking attendant had questioned my right to use a disabled parking space, but he couldn't question the service that had earned me that right. He had questioned my honesty, but he couldn't question the integrity that had guided my entire life. As I moved through the store, collecting the ingredients for tamales, I found myself thinking about the young girl who had asked if I was really a soldier. Her question had been asked with such wonder, such possibility, as if the idea of a Latina soldier was something magical and inspiring rather than threatening or suspicious. When I returned to my car, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper. For a moment, my heart raced. Was it another citation? A nasty message from someone who had witnessed the confrontation? Instead, it was a handwritten note from the veteran who had spoken up in my defense. Sister, thank you for your service and for standing up for yourself today. What happened was wrong and I'm filing a complaint with store management. You deserve better from your country. Semper Fi. Marine Sergeant, Ret. James Patterson. But that wasn't the only note. There were 3 more. Thank you for showing my daughter what courage looks like. A grateful mom. I'm a veteran too and I'm ashamed this happened to you. You represent the best of what America should be. Army Staff Sergeant, Ret. Maria Gonzalez. Your dignity and strength today inspired me. Thank you for not backing down. Dr. Sarah Johnson, Emergency Room Physician. That collection of notes meant more to me than any medal or commendation I had ever received, because it represented something I had been searching for my entire life. Recognition not despite my identity but including all of it. These people had seen me as a fellow veteran, a role model, a person deserving of respect, regardless of my ethnicity or gender. As I drove home, I thought about the young girl who had asked if I was really a soldier. I thought about her bright smile when I confirmed that yes, Latinos could be soldiers, could be counselors, could be anything they wanted to be. That night, I called my supervisor at the VA hospital and told her about the incident. Dr. Patricia Williams had been my mentor since I'd started working at the hospital, and she was one of the few people who truly understood the unique challenges faced by minority veterans. Maya, she said after I finished my story, I'm so sorry that happened to you, but I'm proud of how you handled it. You showed that girl and everyone else watching what dignity looks like. We talked for over an hour about the incident, its implications, and what it revealed about the ongoing challenges faced by minority veterans. Dr. Williams encouraged me to file a formal complaint and to consider sharing my story more broadly. This isn't just about you, she said. This is about every minority veteran who has faced discrimination, every young person who needs to see that they can serve with honor, every person who needs to understand that heroism comes in many different colors and languages. The next day, I received a call from the grocery store manager. The parking attendant had been suspended pending a full investigation. Multiple customers had filed complaints about his behavior, and security footage had captured the entire incident. Ms. Rodriguez, the manager said, we want to make this right. We're implementing additional training for all our security personnel about disability awareness and cultural sensitivity. We're also reviewing our parking enforcement policies to ensure this never happens again. The manager, Janet Morrison, invited me to meet with her and the store's human resources director to discuss the incident in detail. During that meeting, I learned that this wasn't the first complaint against the parking attendant. There had been other incidents, other customers who had felt discriminated against, but none had been as public or well documented as mine. Ms. Rodriguez, Janet said, your courage in standing up for yourself has opened our eyes to problems we should have addressed long ago. We're committed to making real changes, not just offering empty apologies. It was a start, but I knew it wasn't enough. Real change doesn't happen because of one incident or one complaint. Real change happens when enough people stand up, speak out, and refuse to accept discrimination as just the way things are. A week later, I was contacted by a local veterans organization that had heard about the incident. They asked if I would be willing to share my story at their next meeting, to help educate other veterans about the unique challenges faced by minority service members. The Veterans of Foreign Wars Post 2394 met in a small hall in central Phoenix, a space decorated with flags, photos of fallen soldiers, and memorabilia from conflicts spanning 7 decades. Standing at the podium in a room full of veterans, men and women of all ages, races, and backgrounds, I felt the same strength I had felt in that parking lot. These were my brothers and sisters in arms, people who understood sacrifice and service and the weight of carrying invisible wounds. Brothers and sisters, I began, we all took an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. But sometimes the domestic enemies aren't foreign invaders or terrorists. Sometimes they're prejudice, discrimination, and the assumption that some of us are more worthy of respect than others. I told them about the parking lot, about the assumptions, about the way discrimination can make you question your own worth. But I also told them about standing up, speaking out, and refusing to be diminished. They can question our right to be here, I said, echoing my grandmother's words, but they cannot question our worth. We earned our place in this country through service, sacrifice, and love. Nobody gets to take that away from us. The applause was thunderous, but more important were the conversations that followed. Veteran after veteran approached me to share their own stories of discrimination. The Muslim veteran who was questioned at airports despite his service, the Native American veteran whose patriotism was questioned because of his heritage, the female veteran who was told she was taking jobs away from real veterans. One story particularly struck me. A Korean War veteran named Robert Kim told me about returning from combat in 1953 only to be denied service at restaurants because of his Asian heritage. I had just spent 2 years fighting communism, he said, and I came home to a country that treated me like the enemy. A Vietnam veteran named Patricia Running Bear shared her experience of being told she didn't look like a real Indian when she tried to access Native American veteran benefits, despite having served 2 tours in Vietnam and carrying visible scars from combat wounds. Each story was different, but they all shared common threads: the assumption that some veterans were more authentic than others, the presumption that service and sacrifice looked a certain way, the persistent belief that respect had to be earned over and over again by those who didn't fit the traditional image of an American hero. But they also shared stories of resilience, of standing up, of refusing to be invisible or silent in the face of injustice. 6 months after the parking lot incident, I received an unexpected phone call. It was from a documentary filmmaker named David Chin who was creating a film about discrimination against minority veterans. He had heard about my story through the Veterans Organization and wanted to know if I would participate. "Maya," he said, "your story represents something important about the gap between how we talk about supporting veterans and how we actually treat veterans who don't fit the expected profile. Would you be willing to share your experience?" The decision to participate in the documentary wasn't easy. It meant reliving the humiliation and anger of that day, but it also meant potentially reaching people who needed to hear the message that discrimination against veterans was still a real and present problem. The filming process took several months and involved multiple interviews, not just with me but with dozens of other minority veterans who had faced similar challenges. The director was careful to frame our stories not as complaints or grievances, but as calls for understanding and change. The documentary, titled Service and Sacrifice: The Untold Stories of Minority Veterans, premiered at the Phoenix Film Festival a year later. Sitting in the theater watching my story on the big screen, I thought about how far I had come from that day in the parking lot. The film didn't just tell my story, it told the stories of dozens of minority veterans who had faced discrimination, questioning, and assumptions about their worthiness. But it also told stories of triumph, of communities coming together to support their veterans, of organizations working to create real change. After the screening, during the Q&A session, a young Latina woman raised her hand. She looked to be about college age, with serious eyes and a determined expression that reminded me of myself at that age. "Ms. Rodriguez," she said, "I'm thinking about joining the military, but I'm scared about facing discrimination. How did you find the strength to keep serving?" I thought about her question for a long moment, remembering my own fears and doubts when I first enlisted. "Mija," I said, using the same term of endearment my grandmother had always used with me, "I won't lie to you, you will face challenges that others won't face. You will have to prove yourself over and over again. You will encounter people who question your right to wear the uniform." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. "But here's what I learned," I continued. "Your service doesn't become less valuable because some people fail to recognize its value. Your sacrifice doesn't become less meaningful because some people fail to understand its meaning. Your worth as a veteran, and as a human being, is not determined by other people's prejudices." I paused, thinking about that little girl in the parking lot who had asked if I was really a soldier. When you serve, you're not just serving for the people who already respect you. You're serving for the people who need to learn what respect looks like. You're serving for the little girls who need to see that they can wear the uniform too. You're serving for the future veterans who will face fewer challenges because you helped pave the way. The young woman nodded, tears in her eyes, and I knew she understood. 2 years after the parking lot incident, I was promoted to senior counselor at the VA hospital. My new role included developing programs specifically designed to address the unique challenges faced by minority veterans, the additional barriers they face in accessing services, the cultural competency needed to provide effective care, the importance of representation in veteran leadership. During my first presentation to the hospital's leadership team, I began with a story they had all heard before. The story of a Latina veteran being harassed in a parking lot for using disabled veteran parking spaces. That incident taught me something important. I told them. Discrimination against veterans doesn't just happen in obvious ways, through protests or disrespect. It happens in subtle ways, through assumptions and stereotypes that make some veterans feel less welcome, less valued, less deserving of the services they earned through their sacrifice. The programs we developed included cultural competency training for all staff, peer counseling programs led by minority veterans, and outreach initiatives designed to connect with underserved veteran communities. We also established a mentorship program pairing experienced minority veterans with those just beginning their transition to civilian life. The success of these programs exceeded our expectations. Within the first year, we saw a 25% increase in minority veterans accessing mental health services, a significant improvement in treatment outcomes, and overwhelmingly positive feedback from both patients and staff. The programs we developed have now been implemented at VA hospitals across the Southwest, and I've been invited to speak at conferences nationwide about creating inclusive environments for minority veterans. But the moment that meant the most came 3 years after that day in the parking lot. I was leaving the grocery store, the same grocery store where it all began, when I noticed a young Latino man in military dress uniform struggling with grocery bags while walking with a noticeable limp. "Soldier," I called out, and he turned with the automatic response that military training instills in all of us. "Yes, ma'am?" "Let me help you with those bags," I said, walking over to where he was parked, in a disabled parking space, with disabled veteran plates clearly visible on his car. As we loaded his groceries, he thanked me and mentioned that he was nervous about using disabled parking spaces because he was young and didn't look disabled. "Brother," I said, "let me tell you something. You earned those plates through your service and sacrifice. Don't let anyone make you feel like you have to justify using them." I told him about my own experience in that very parking lot, about standing up to discrimination, about the importance of claiming the space and respect we've earned. He listened with wide eyes, and when I finished, he stood a little straighter. "Ma'am," he said, "thank you for paving the way for veterans like me." His name was Luis Morales, and he had been wounded in Syria while serving with the Marine Corps. Like me, he struggled with the visibility of his disability and the assumptions people made about young veterans. As I drove home that day, I thought about the ripple effects of that moment in the parking lot. One incident of discrimination had led to complaints, policy changes, sensitivity training, documentary films, new programs for minority veterans, and countless conversations about respect, service, and the many different faces of American heroism. But most importantly, it had led to a young veteran feeling more confident about claiming his rightful place in a world that sometimes questions his worth. That evening, I called my grandmother to tell her about my day. At 93, she was still sharp, still full of wisdom, still the moral compass that guided my life. "Mija," she said after I finished my story, "remember what I always told you about the tamales?" I smiled, knowing she was about to share one of her favorite metaphors. The masa, it has to be strong enough to hold all the filling but soft enough to let the flavors blend together. That's like America, no? We have to be strong enough to hold all different kinds of people, but soft enough to let all our different flavors make the country better. "Sí, abuela," I agreed. "But sometimes the masa needs to be reminded that all the ingredients belong." "Exacto," she said. "And sometimes, Mija, we are the ones doing the reminding." As I hung up the phone, I thought about that parking attendant from 4 years ago. I wondered if he remembered our encounter, if it had changed how he saw people who looked like me, if he had learned to look at license plates before making assumptions about worthiness. I hoped so, but I also knew that my worth, and the worth of every veteran who looks like me, didn't depend on his recognition or anyone else's. We had earned our place through service, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to the ideals this country represents at its best. We had earned it through moments of courage under fire, through years of helping others heal, through the daily choice to keep serving even when service goes unrecognized or unappreciated. 5 years after the parking lot incident, I was invited to speak at a national conference on veteran affairs in Washington, D.C. The keynote address was titled "Beyond Thank You for Your Service: Creating Truly Inclusive Communities for All Veterans." Standing before an audience of policymakers, veteran advocates, and service organization leaders, I began with the same story I had told dozens of times before. The story of a Tuesday afternoon in a Scottsdale parking lot. The parking attendant's eyes burned with disgust as he approached my car. I began, and I could see the audience lean forward, recognizing that they were about to hear something important. I told them about the assumptions, the discrimination, the moment when everything changed. But I also told them about the young girl who asked if I was really a soldier, about the notes left on my windshield, about the programs that had grown out of that moment of injustice. That incident taught me that discrimination against veterans doesn't just hurt individuals, it hurts our entire community, I said. When we allow prejudice to determine who is seen as a real veteran, we diminish the service and sacrifice of everyone who has worn the uniform. The response to my speech was immediate and powerful. Within weeks, I was contacted by veteran organizations across the country asking for help developing similar programs. The Department of Veterans Affairs expressed interest in implementing some of our initiatives on a national scale. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source: a letter from the parking attendant himself. "Ms. Rodriguez," the letter began, "I have thought about our encounter every day for the past 5 years. I want you to know that your dignity and strength that day changed me fundamentally as a person. I began attending diversity training, volunteering with veteran organizations, and learning about the experiences of minority service members. I cannot undo the harm I caused you, but I can promise that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be better. Thank you for showing me what honor really looks like." Reading that letter, I felt a complex mix of emotions: validation, forgiveness, hope, and a deep sense that real change was possible when people were willing to confront their own prejudices and grow. Today, when I park in disabled veteran spaces, I do so with pride and confidence. Not because I need to prove anything to anyone, but because I refuse to let other people's prejudices diminish the value of my service. I think about that little girl in the parking lot sometimes, the one who asked if I was really a soldier. She's a teenager now, and according to her grandmother, she's still planning to join the military when she graduates from high school. I hope she remembers seeing a Latina veteran stand up for herself that day. I hope she remembers that dignity is not given. It's claimed, defended, and never apologized for. They judged me by my skin before they saw my service. They questioned my worth before they understood my sacrifice. They assumed I was taking something I didn't deserve before they realized I had given more than most people ever will. But in the end, their assumptions said everything about them and nothing about me. My worth was never theirs to determine, and my place in this country was never theirs to question. I am Maya Rodriguez. I am a disabled veteran, a trauma counselor, a granddaughter of immigrants, and an American who refuses to be made small by other people's small thinking. They saw what they expected to see. I showed them who I really am. And that, in the end, is how we change the world, one encounter, one conversation, one moment of courage at a time. Because they can question our right to be here, but they cannot question our worth. Our worth comes from within, from our service, our sacrifice, and our unwavering commitment to being exactly who we are, with dignity, with pride, and with the absolute certainty that we belong here just as much as anyone else. That's the lesson that parking lot taught me, and it's a lesson I'll carry for the rest of my life.